The key was ice-cold, an antique skeleton of tarnished brass, and it felt heavier than it should in Ben's palm. The man at the front desk, a gaunt figure with eyes the color of old dishwater, hadn't spoken a word when Ben checked in. He'd simply slid the key across the polished oak countertop, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over Ben's shoulder, and pointed a long, bony finger toward the trail leading into the pines. Ben had come to Pinecrest Lodge for silence. After the chaos of the city, the constant digital hum, and the echoing quiet of his own empty apartment after Sarah left, he craved the kind of quiet that only deep woods could provide. The main lodge, with its roaring fireplace and mounted deer heads, felt oppressively social. Cabin 9, the desk clerk's scribbled map showed, was the farthest out, perched on the lip of Blackwater Lake. The path was a tunnel of gloom. The ancient cedars swallowed the late afternoon light, their branches knitting together a ceiling that turned the world beneath a perpetual twilight. The only sounds were the crunch of his boots on pine needles and the distant, hollow cry of a loon. By the time the trees thinned and the dark, still water of the lake came into view, the silence had become a physical presence, thick and watchful. Cabin 9 looked like a charcoal sketch against the steel-gray water. It was smaller than the others he'd passed, built from logs gone near black with age and moisture. The single window beside the heavy oak door was a dark, blank eye. He fumbled with the key, the lock turned with a screech of protesting metal that shattered the quiet like glass. The interior was one room, a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, a bed with a patchwork quilt, and a smell damp wood, old ashes, and beneath it, something faintly metallic, like the scent after a lightning strike. It was cold. Colder than it should have been. Ben dropped his bag and set about building a fire, the ritual soothing his nerves. As the flames took hold, casting jittering shadows on the walls, he finally began to relax. He made dinner, read by firelight, and by 10 o'clock, the deep woods exhaustion pulled at him. He climbed into the bed, the old springs groaning in complaint, and was asleep almost before his head hit the pillow. He woke to the sound of dripping. Plink. 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 It was a slow, insistent cadence, coming from the corner of the room near the fireplace. Ben sighed. A leak. He fumbled for his phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the stone hearth. It was dry. He swung the light to the ceiling. No water stain, no drip. Plink. 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 It was closer now. Coming from the foot of the bed. His blood went slack in his veins. He pointed the light. The worn floorboards were dry. But the sound was clear, measured, real. It was the sound of a single drop of water falling into a still pool. And it was moving. Plink. By the door. Plink. By the window. Plink. Right next to his ear, on the pillow. He jerked upright, sweating. The cabin was silent. The fire had burned down to embers, painting the room in a hellish orange glow. His heart hammered against his ribs. A dream. A stress-induced auditory hallucination. He lay back down, forcing his breaths to slow. The scratching began an hour later. It was a faint, furtive sound at first, like a mouse in the walls. Then it grew more deliberate. Scritch. Scritch. Scrape. It was coming from the outside wall, right behind the headboard. Something was dragging slowly down the length of the cabin's exterior logs. Ben froze, ears straining. The scratching stopped. Then it started again, this time on the roof. A slow, heavy drag, from one edge to the peak, then back down. Thump. Something had landed on the porch. Logic screamed that it was an animal, a raccoon, a bear. But instinct, a primal wire thrumming in the base of his skull, knew better. No animal moved with that patient, deliberate purpose. No animal was that quiet after it landed. He saw it then, in the dying firelight. A shape outside the window. Not a full form, but a distortion, a patch of deeper darkness that blotted out the faint glow of the moon on the lake. It stood there, perfectly still. Ben stopped breathing. The doorknob began to turn. It rotated slowly, with a faint, gritty rasp. The lock held. The knob rattled, once, gently, as if testing its strength. Then it was still. Ben didn't move for a century. He watched the window. The shape was gone. The only sound was the frantic drum of his own heart. When dawn's first gray light finally seeped into the cabin, he was still sitting bolt upright, quilt pulled to his chin, his knuckles white. The morning was a misty, beautiful lie. Sunbeams cut through the mist over Blackwater Lake. Birds sang. It was pristine, peaceful. The terror of the night felt silly, a product of isolation and an overactive imagination. He needed coffee, and human contact. The gaunt clerk was polishing the same spot on the counter when Ben walked into the main lodge. His expression didn't change. "Morning," Ben said, his voice rough. "Cabin 9 is quaint. Heard some animals last night. Anything I should know about?" The clerk stopped polishing. He lifted his dishwater eyes and looked directly at Ben for the first time. There was no curiosity in that gaze, only a flat, weary knowledge. "Cabin 8 is available," the man said, his voice like dry leaves. "No extra charge." Ben's bravado faltered. "Why would I want to move?" The clerk leaned forward slightly. "People who stay in cabin 9, they often don't sleep well. They hear things." The previous guest, Mr. Albright, he checked out very suddenly. Middle of the night. Left all his things. What happened to him? Ben asked, a chill creeping up his spine. "He didn't say," the clerk whispered. "But he kept wiping his neck. As if something was dripping on him." Ben felt the memory of the plink right by his ear. The cold spot on his pillow. He shoved his hands in his pockets to hide their trembling. "I'll be fine. It was just the wind." The clerk's lips stretched into a thin, mirthless line. Not a smile. A suture. "Of course. The key, sir?" Ben handed over the icy brass key. The clerk's fingers brushed his, and they were shockingly, unnaturally cold. The rest of the day, Ben tried to enjoy the wilderness. He hiked, he skipped stones on the lake, but the beauty was now a veneer. The woods felt like they were holding their breath. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was expectant. As twilight bled into dusk, a profound reluctance settled over him. The path to cabin 9 looked like a throat. He forced himself to walk it. He rebuilt the fire, bigger this time. He checked the locks twice. He pulled the heavy table and shoved it against the door, a barricade of pathetic, human logic. He sat in the chair facing the door, a hatchet from the woodpile on the floor beside him, and waited. 4 hours, nothing happened. The fire crackled. The wind sighed in the pines. He began to nod off, his chin dipping to his chest. Plink. His eyes snapped open. It was in the center of the room now. A small, dark circle had appeared on the floorboards, as if a drop of ink had fallen from the ceiling. But the ceiling above it was bare, solid wood. Plink. Another drop fell from midair, widening the stain. The sound was louder, wetter. Plink. 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 The drops came faster, forming a ragged line across the floor, leading toward the bed. The stain wasn't water. It was black and viscous, soaking into the thirsty wood with a faint hiss. A smell filled the cabin, the coppery tang of blood, the ozone of a storm, and that old, wet ash smell, now overwhelming. The scratching started on the inside of the roof this time, right above him. Scritch, 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 scrape. Ben grabbed the hatchet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Who's there?" he yelled, the sound pitifully small in the consuming quiet. The fire suddenly dimmed, the flames sucking down to blue ghosts. The temperature plunged. His breath fogged in the air. In the window, the shape returned. It was clearer now. Tall, impossibly thin, its limbs seeming to bend in too many places. It had no face, only a smooth, dark expanse where a face should be, perpetually glistening, as if wet. The lock on the door clicked open. The table, his barricade, shuddered. Then it slid sideways across the floor as if pushed by a giant, unseen hand, screeching against the planks. The door didn't swing open. It inhaled open, a slow, silent yawn into the pitch-black night. Nothing stood in the doorway. The dripping was a steady patter now, a downpour contained entirely within the four walls of the cabin. The black stain on the floor had spread to the size of a rug, and from its center, something was rising. A form, humanoid but wrong, sculpted from the same glistening, dripping darkness as the thing at the window. It pulled itself up from the floorboards like a man rising from a tar pit. Ben swung the hatchet. It passed through the dripping form with a sickening schlorp, sticking fast as if in thick mud. A cold, paralyzing numbness shot up his arm. He let go, stumbling back. The thing from the stain and the thing at the window were suddenly beside him. They didn't walk, the space around them simply changed. A cold, wet tendril, smelling of lake-bottom decay, brushed his neck. Plink. He felt it then, a single, freezing drop, landing on the crown of his head. It traced a path down his temple, like a tear. He looked up. Above him, suspended from the dark ceiling like a hibernating bat, was the missing Mr. Albright. Or what was left of him. His body was desiccated, mummified by the cold, but his face was frozen in a perfect rictus of terror. And from his open, staring eyes, a continuous, slow drip of black fluid welled and fell. Plink. The drop landed on Ben's lips. It tasted of salt, and fear, and infinite loneliness. The wet hands closed around him. They were not forceful, but inexorable, like the steady pull of the lake's depths. They drew him down toward the spreading black stain on the floor. He didn't scream. The cold had locked his throat. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him whole was the open doorway, and the gaunt clerk standing just beyond the threshold, watching with his flat, knowing eyes. The next guest arrived at Pinecrest Lodge a week later, seeking quiet. The gaunt clerk slid a cold, brass key across the counter. "Cabin 9 is available," he said, his voice a dry whisper. "It's our most private." As the new guest walked down the darkening path, the clerk allowed himself a slow, thin smile. He reached under the counter and turned the small, hand-painted sign that always faced him. It read, in simple letters, "Cabin 9 occupied." He turned it back around, showing the guests retreating back the side that always faced the woods, Cabin 9 vacant. Inside Cabin 9, the floorboards were spotless. The air was still and cold. And from a single, dark knot in the pine ceiling, a single bead of moisture slowly gathered, swelling in the silence. Plink.